Welcome to the Old Testament Today, Lesson 3, The Historical Facts.
Imagine I'm going to go on a little trip, a day trip in the motor car. And I want to go from Melbourne all the way over to Portland. I use a map to plan my journey, and I use the map to help me along the way as I progress along the journey. I decide that I'll leave the Mornington Peninsula. Instead of going by ferry, I'll go up to the city of Melbourne, and then take the freeway to Geelong. Then I'll get onto Highway 1 through Winchelsea, on my way to Colac. On the map I have to turn the page and continue my way from Colac through Camperdown and Terang down to the coast at Warrnambool. And then I'll do the lovely trip along the coast road through Port Fairy around to Portland, and thus complete my journey. Now you will have noticed that in using the map there was a point where I had to turn the page and go over to another map, and I could not complete my journey being guided by the map unless I were to turn over the page and continue on the next page to follow the guidelines in my journey. But that doesn't mean that because I have turned over to this page that I don't want that page anymore. And in fact, the way this map is constructed, if I tried to discard that page, I would end up discarding this page as well. The new page and the old page are really one and the same map. And it's like that with the Old and the New Testaments. As we read the Bible, man's early journey towards God is in the Old Testament. And there comes a point, that's at the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, where we, as it were, turn the page in God's revelation. And then the New Testament story continues, and so through the New Testament we're able to reach the journey. Those who remain in the Old Testament and who don't believe in the New Testament, and those who just take the Old Testament scriptures, they will never ever get to the end of the journey, because they get to that point and stop where they ought to turn the page and then continue through the guidance of God's revelation in the New Covenant of Jesus Christ and in the New Testament scriptures, but they don't. But there are others who think that because they are now on this page, that is the New Testament, they should discard the old page. But that's not right, because like this map, the two are so linked together that you cannot separate them. And besides, as I go along on my journey, I might want to look back to where I've been on the map to compare distances with the distances on this map, and to check the way that I've been compared to the way that I'm going to go. I still want this part of the map. I don't want to throw it away. And in the same way with our scriptures, we still want the Old Testament scriptures, just like we want the New Testament scriptures, and we don't want to throw the Old Testament away. We still want to be able to look back to it for reference. We still consider it to be an integral part of the Holy Scriptures. That Bible is like that two-sided page in my roadmap. You can't separate the two parts of the Bible and discard one. I don't know about you, but I like to play the game of Scrabble. And there is in the game of Scrabble another good illustration of the kind of thing that I'm trying to explain to you. It's the start of the game and tension is very high here at the Scrabble Championship, and these are the 7 letters that the player who is to begin has chosen. Not much of a selection, I'm afraid. and he puts his considerable intellect to use, but all he can come up with is his HIS. Not much of a word, is it, in Scrabble? 4, 5, 6, doubled, 12. Not much of a score in Scrabble for our champion. The opponent has done slightly better, collecting a couple of double letter scores, has made 15. But still not very worthy scores. In the great game of Scrabble, the champion and the challenger have not so far in this early stage of the game made much of a showing. Just taking a look now at the champion's stock. He has picked up, in place of his HIS, he's picked up LTR. What can he do with the set of letters now before him? He's racking his brains, turning the letters over in his mind. Oh, and what a reply. This shows the genius of the man, doesn't it? He has added to his own word, his, made it historical. And in doing so, he's collected a score of 16 for the word. It's a triple word score, making 48. And he has used all 7 letters. Therefore, he adds 50 to the score, making almost the done. 98. What a score to get the game going. And what a pleasant little fantasy. Those sort of things in real life, in a real game of Scrabble, never happened to me. But what I want to point out is that this big word with its big score, this word historical that was worth 98, depended upon there being the little word that was only worth 12 right there at the beginning. If the word his had not been on the board, the word historical could not have been made. And although the word historical completely replaces the word his, it still remains true that if the word his hadn't been there in the first place, the word historical with its gigantic score would not have been able to come into being. You can see the analogy, can't you? If the Old Testament had not been there, as weak as it was, then the New Testament would not have been able to come into being. Jesus could not have mediated the New Testament unless the Old Testament had been there in the first place. And just as in the Scrabble game, the word historical replaced the word his, nevertheless you can still see the word his, you can still appreciate its value, and its score still applies. It didn't lose its value simply because it was replaced by another word. And the Old Testament has not lost its value to Christians simply because it has been replaced by the New Testament which they follow. If the Old Testament was lost, if somehow it just vanished out of the world, we Christians would miss an awful lot. In our last lesson we looked at 2 Timothy chapter 3 verses 15 to 17, which showed us that the scriptures of the Old Testament have wisdom that can lead us to salvation. They are inspired, that is, they are words which are breathed by God. They are words that are profitable for teaching, and they are able to completely equip us for every good work. Certainly we could not afford to be without these things. So far we have been generalizing, and I'd like now to get down in the rest of our studies to talking in more detail about the things that we would miss if the Old Testament disappeared, about the things that are of value to us in the Old Testament as Christians. And the first of those things, and we're going to spend the rest of this lesson talking about it, is that we would miss the historical facts of the Old Testament. We would miss the historical facts of the Old Testament. Now, there are two reasons for this. Let's take the first one, the most obvious one. If we didn't have the Old Testament with all of its historical facts recorded, we couldn't understand a great part of the New Testament. Because there are many things that are said in the New Testament that assume that you have a knowledge of what the Old Testament says, that you have a knowledge of the facts that are recorded there. If you don't, then much of the New Testament becomes incomprehensible. So those who wrote the New Testament predicated their writings upon the assumption that you have already read and become familiar with the Old Testament scriptures. Now, I can give you a couple of good examples of this, just simply to illustrate. In Hebrews chapter 13, verse 1, we read, "Let brotherly love continue. Do not forget to entertain strangers, for by doing so some have unwittingly entertained angels." As the old King James Version puts it, some have entertained angels unawares. Have you ever wondered what that means? It's easy enough to understand what it means when it says, "Let brotherly love continue." Although the way some Christians act, one wonders whether they even comprehend the meaning of brotherly love. But all that aside, what happens when you get to the next verse and read about entertaining angels unawares? We wouldn't know what that meant if we didn't have the Old Testament scriptures to enlighten us. We might think that, for example, an angel could come along to our doorstep and we wouldn't be aware of it, and that angel may be in the guise of some human being, perhaps a beggar or something like that, and that we might just entertain or give something to that beggar and be doing it for an angel without realizing it. We might get that idea from the verse if we didn't have any proper knowledge to go on. But as it turns out, it doesn't have any meaning like that at all. It's just simply saying there have been, in the past, occasions when people, in just simply being hospitable, have actually entertained angels without being aware of it. At least, not at the first. And it's not saying that the same thing can happen to you, but that this is a good reason why you should be hospitable and why you should be generous, because you never know where that generosity and that goodness can lead. It doesn't mean that you might entertain an angel unaware, but something of equivalent importance could happen to you, and you have no idea whatsoever of what good you can do just by a simple act of kindness and charity. But back in the Old Testament, we find historical facts that enlighten us as to what the Hebrew writer was referring to when he spoke of some who have entertained angels unwittingly. In Genesis chapter 18, we see Abraham lifting up his eyes, and he looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground. And he said, "My Lord, if I have now found favour in your sight, do not pass on by your servant." And later we see in verse 6 that Abraham hastened into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it, and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took a tender and good calf and gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. And so on, Abraham offering hospitality to these 3 men. But as we read on through the story, it becomes evident that these 3 men were angels of the Lord. There's a similar example in Judges 13 concerning Manoah, who was the father of Samson. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "Please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you." And the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, "Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord." For Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. Now here we see that Manoah was wishing to entertain this person, not knowing, being unaware that it was an angel. So that's what the Hebrew writer means when he says, "For some have entertained angels unawares." If we look back into the record of the Old Testament, we will find out who they were that the Hebrew writer refers to. We will even be able to put names to them, like Abraham and Manoah. They are the some who have entertained angels unawares. There, of course, may have been other cases, but there we can see from the Old Testament record something that helps us to comprehend a passage in the New Testament. Now let me give you just another example, a very simple example. In Luke 17, verse 32, Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife." Now what does that mean? You wouldn't know what it means if you were not able to have some access to information about who Lot's wife was and what she did. You can't remember something or derive any benefit from something that you've never been told. And so if the Old Testament scriptures did not contain some factual information about this person, Lot's wife, then this statement of Jesus would be totally incomprehensible and useless to us. But when we can go back into Genesis 19 and read that Lot's wife was a woman who was told by God, "If you disobey my command, you'll be turned into a pillar of salt." And she disobeyed God's command not to look back at the city she was leaving. And she was turned into a pillar of salt. And that is a lesson for us, that God, when he says something, expects us to take notice of it and to obey it. And if we don't, we'll be punished. And so when Jesus says, "Remember Lot's wife," that means something to us. That's an exhortation to us, because we can go back into the Old Testament and find out who Lot's wife was and what she did and what happened to her and why. And then we can remember that and learn a lesson from it. That's the value of the Old Testament. And I could give you dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of places in the New Testament that just would not have any meaning for us unless we could go back and study the Old Testament and find out the information there that is needed in order to understand what the New Testament is talking about. And so there's one reason why we would miss the historical facts that the Old Testament records. Many New Testament passages can be comprehended only in the light of the Old Testament record. So we need the Old Testament record to help us understand the New Testament. But it actually goes deeper than that, and I want to now give you a second reason why we would miss the historical record contained in the Old Testament. And this is a little more difficult to grasp, but it's still just as important as our first statement. We would miss the historical facts in the Old Testament because they help to establish the integrity of the New Testament. Let me explain what I mean. As we read the New Testament, we find that an awful lot of it quotes the Old Testament, or alludes to the Old Testament, or is somehow constructed upon something that the Old Testament says. If you were to take out of the New Testament every quote, every allusion, and every argument that has reference to the Old Testament, you wouldn't have a whole lot of substance left in the New Testament. And so the New Testament scriptures are very reliant upon the Old Testament. Now that has one very important ramification for Christians, and that is that if the Old Testament is unreliable, if the integrity of the Old Testament is called into question, then necessarily the New Testament, which relies so heavily upon it and draws so much from it, the New Testament also is unreliable, and its integrity is called into question. So you can see that if we are going to continue to have faith in the New Testament scriptures, we must also be able to continue to have faith in the Old Testament scriptures, because the one relies upon the other. And the New Testament stands or falls with the Old Testament in terms of integrity. Now that's why the historical record of the Old Testament is so important, because if we haven't got the Old Testament record, we can't keep on subjecting it to examination. We can't keep on going back to it and examining it to see if it does in fact remain a book of historical integrity. And if it isn't a book of historical integrity, and we can't keep on establishing that as time goes by, then its integrity in other ways is called into question. Now I know there are some people who can live with a document that they consider to be historically incorrect and scientifically incorrect and in many other ways incorrect and contradictory of the facts, and yet still value it as a religious document. Frankly, I can't follow that reasoning, and I think probably you can't follow it very well either. We rely upon the Old Testament to be, in every way, in everything that it says, to be in agreement with all things that we know to be true. And if the Old Testament conflicts with or contradicts something that we can prove to be true, then we have no reason to trust the Old Testament in any way. And if that is the case, we have no reason to trust the New Testament either, which relies so heavily upon the Old Testament. They both stand or fall together, and the falling in one particular area is enough to make us mistrust the book in any other area. That's why the historical facts are so important, because if we can keep on establishing that the Old Testament is reliable for its historical facts, then we can go on to say, well, it's reliable in other things, surely. If it's proved its reliability in one area, why mistrust it in some other area? And if the Old Testament is trustworthy, well, then so is the New Testament trustworthy, because it is built upon the facts of the Old Testament. One task of the archaeologist is to physically establish facts of ancient history and thus to verify ancient writings. Historical statements and references in the Old Testament have been verified by archaeological findings, in many cases quite beyond doubt. Where certain things had once to be taken in trust, archaeology has now made these things more certain, because they are established in the mouth of two witnesses, the witness of the Old Testament scripture and the witness of archaeological science. As time goes by, more and more of the Bible record is being placed beyond doubt as man searches the sands and the clays for their record of past events. I wanted to give you just one example of the multitude available, of how the findings of the archaeologists have corroborated those historical details which are recorded in the Old Testament scripture. Now, I'm not an expert on these things myself, so I rang up Murray Adamswaite of Endeavour Hills, who is both a believer in the Bible and also an expert in archaeology, especially as it relates to the Bible. And I said, Murray, would you just give me one example I can give the people that will illustrate to them how the archaeological findings, it's a hard word to say that, how they have corroborated the Old Testament history. And he said, well, just as one example, you take Daniel chapter 5, where we read the story of Belshazzar's feast. Verse 1 says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. Then later on in verse 5 it says, in the same hour the fingers of a man's hand appeared and wrote opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Now Murray explained to me that the name Belshazzar was not recorded anywhere except in the Bible. Until 100 years ago, cuneiform documents were discovered which did name Belshazzar. And not only that, but the dating of those documents and the place where they had Belshazzar and so on, all fitted with the Bible's details. And so what was taken on trust for so long has now been corroborated by the findings of the archaeologist. But that's not all in this passage. In verse 5 you will notice that the hand appeared on the plaster of the wall in the king's palace. Now for a long while the only buildings known in the area had walls of glazed brick, not plaster. And so this verse in the Bible had to be taken on trust, that this room was somewhat different to the normal buildings, in that it had plaster wall, because that's what the Bible says, not a wall of glazed brick. But then archaeologists' discoveries showed that indeed the throne room of the palace was different, in that it did have plaster walls, rather than the normal glazed brick walls. Now these are only details, but they serve to illustrate how the historical facts, no matter how detailed, that are written in the Bible, are being corroborated as time goes by what the archaeologists discover. Well, that's the end of our lesson. I'm sure you realize that there's much more in the Old Testament than just historical facts. But I hope that this particular program has helped you to appreciate the historical facts that are in the Old Testament, because they both help us to understand the New Testament better, and they help us to have more faith in its integrity.
Thank you for watching. You are invited to visit simplybible.com.